The following is the essay by Lauren Gravitz, My Spotless Mind. It's been chopped down for time, but I would highly encourage everyone to check out this truly amazing essay when you have the time. Imagine you're the manager of a cafe. It stays open late and the neighborhood has gone quiet by the time you lock the doors. You put the evening's earnings into a bank bag, tuck that into your backpack, and head home. It's a short walk through a poorly lit park, and there next to the pond you realize you've been hearing footsteps behind you. Before you can turn around, a man sprints up and stabs you in the stomach. When you fall to the ground, he kicks you, grabs your backpack, and runs off. Fortunately, a bystander calls an ambulance which takes you, bleeding and shaken, to the nearest hospital. The emergency room physician stitches you up and tells you that, aside from the pain and a bit of blood loss, you're in good shape. Then she sits down and looks you in the eye. She tells you that people who live through a traumatic event like yours often develop post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. But she has a pill you can take right now that will decrease your recall of the night's events, and thus the fear and other emotions associated with it, and guard against the potential effects of PTSD without completely erasing the memory itself. Would you like to try it? If someone were to ask me how I felt about scrubbing away emotional memories, I'd advise them to think hard about it. After all, that's what I did. And I might never forgive myself. I have a gaping hole in my memory where my father should be, the result of a particularly effective attempt at not dealing by my adolescent brain. My father had multiple sclerosis. It wasn't something I thought much about growing up, other than dedicating a 6th grade science fair project to describing the disease. It's an autoimmune disorder of the central nervous system, in which damage to the protective nerve sheaths disrupts neural signaling. It can cause everything from vision problems to paralysis. For my dad, at first, it mostly meant bouts of dizziness and occasional weakness. One January afternoon when I was 12, however, I walked in after school to see both of my working parents at home, in the middle of the day. Something was clearly wrong. My father had caused a car accident that morning, and while both he and the person he'd hit were uninjured, he had no memory of how he got there, a neighborhood in the opposite direction from his office, and remained confused about the gender of the other driver. It was our first clue that his disease was about to take a rare, devastating turn, and steal not only his mobility, but his mind. In a way, it stole my mind too. Within 6 months, my father, a toxicologist and epidemiologist with a PhD in biochemistry, was spending his work days staring vacantly out of his office window. He went from a sharp and quick-witted, if occasionally acerbic, debate partner to someone who was dull and vacuous, if mostly pleasant. He displayed all the joy and petulance of a 4-year-old and had trouble holding up his end of anything but the simplest of conversations. Within months, he progressed from cane to walker to wheelchair, and eventually had so much trouble swallowing he required a gastric feeding tube for nutrition, and a styrofoam cup to spit into so he wouldn't choke on his own saliva. I remember all of this quite clearly. I remember that damned styrofoam cup, the shiny blue of his wheelchair, the glassy look in his eyes. I remember how he hardly recognized me, but how he lit up with the purest smile when my mother entered the room. And despite the fact that I was almost a teenager when the disease began to ravage my father, despite 12 years of prior history dense with family trips and holidays, despite a nightly tradition reading The Hobbit and other books aloud together before bed, I do not remember what my dad was like before he lost his mind. It's not that I don't remember doing all those things. I do. I just can't remember him. On the day of that first bike ride, even though he had just taken the train wheels off my purple Schwinn, I have no idea if he was standing next to my mother when I fell off, or if he was even there at all. It's as if I've taken a scissor to my memories and sliced him right out of the photographs. Decades later, I can't remember him as anything else, no matter how hard I've tried. At the time, I did it quite intentionally. Every time my mother started to ask, "Do you remember when your father?" I would cut her off abruptly. "I don't want to talk about it," I'd say. Then I'd force my brain to bounce past it like a stone skipping off a pond, and focus instead on something less painful, usually the man he had become. Rather than dwelling on the father I'd lost, my teenage brain lessened the heartbreak by replacing him with the man who sat in that blue wheelchair. Decades later, I can't remember him as anything else, no matter how hard I've tried. Yet, knowing someone could one day tell me that they had found a way to grant me access to my memories of my father, I'm no longer certain I would try. I spent years trying to find those memories. I asked relatives and friends for stories. I stared at faded family pictures, trying to infuse them with the personality and warmth that comes only from the act of reminiscing. But perhaps all this time I've been looking for the wrong thing. Perhaps it's okay to let the memories go. Over time, my sliced-up memories have defined my personal understanding of self, and have, ever so gradually, become part of a narrative I'm no longer sure I want to change. Yes, my over-pruned tree is missing some branches and appears rather lopsided. Its flowers don't always open the way they should. But it's also sprouting new leaves in places I never expected. And its crooked visage is simply part of who I am. Rather than trying to fill those empty holes, I can now look at the negative space and see it, all of it, as a part of me.